Hi, I'm Holly Lake Hoagland, the Principal Research Lead here at APQC for our Process and Performance Management area. And today what I want to talk to you about is building success, effective process governance. So what we're going to talk about today is this idea of process governance, which is one of the 7 tenets of APQC's 7 tenets. And the first thing is, what is process governance? So how do we define process governance at APQC? And what are some of the important components that make up process governance? And then we're going to talk about the current state, or how well or organizations doing in this place of process governance. So based on research, case studies, interviews, surveys, what are places where people excel at process governance, and where are places of improvement for organizations to focus on? And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to spend talking about 4 case studies, looking at how different organizations have approached different aspects of process governance, from how to identify as well as enable our process owners, to how do we create standardization and consistency using knowledge repositories. And finally, how can we tie process to audits in a way that helps us manage our risk factors, as well as that consistent performance across the organization. One of APQC's other kind of big IPs in the process and performance management space is what we call the 7 tenets of process management. So a lot of times when organizations do process efforts, they tend to pick or choose 1 or 2 things. So it's either we're really starting off and focusing on improving something that's broken, or we're going about and looking at kind of standardizing and creating models for all of our processes. Or we're going to start doing some automation and start with tools and technology. When a lot of organizations kind of start with one of those focuses, what they wind up having happen is that sometimes the program will fizzle out because they don't have all of the things they need together to create sustainable projects or a sustainable BPM program. And based on decades of research at APQC, we found that there's really 7 kind of pillars that business process management teams need to have that sustainability. And you can see them listed here. The first one is strategic alignment. And really what that does is make sure that we're delivering value that the organization needs, and how do we align to organizational goals. And the second one is governance, and I like to always call it the rules of the road. So what are the pieces of things that we have in place to make sure that things are being executed correctly, that we have oversight to the process efforts, and that it's being done consistently and managed effectively. Process models are really just kind of how do we visualize how work gets done and create transparency around it so people all across the board understand it. Change management is incredibly vital because it's how do we take people along for the ride. As we know, when we're doing process work, we're affecting how people do things. So we need to make sure that we kind of take in that concept of making they understand what it is, what the benefits they're going to get out of it, and how they can play a part in it. Process performance is really how do we know how well our processes are being executed and doing what we want them to do. Process improvement then is really, well, how do we get better? What are the things that we do to improve how our processes are being executed? And the tools and technology is simply what's there to help us in our work and what can be a part of our toolkit as we go through and look at operational excellence or process improvement, or even just traditional business process management in the organization. So what we're going to do today is really focus on that number 2, which is governance. So the big idea is, what is process governance? It means many things to many different organizations. For some people, process governance is simply having process owners. For others, it's making sure that you have controls across the organization, that you have change setups in place for if there's going to be made a difference in, say, an SOP or how a process is being executed. So that's done consistently and with the best benefit for the organization in mind. Now, APQC, like I said, we kind of call it the rules of the game. How we really define governance is that it encompasses all the structural elements that help process management function. It's concerned with roles, responsibilities, accountability, oversight, sponsorship, as well as management structures. Now, the governance of process management really helps dictate the efficiency and the speed at which the organization can implement and ultimately embed process management into its day-to-day practices. And how it does that is through 4 core elements. The first one is this idea of governance teams. And this is simply a body of decision makers that are responsible and accountable for process management efforts within the organization. The second part is roles. And that's another one that people tend to think a lot about when they're thinking about governance. It's the formal and informal roles within the business that are associated with process management and how their alignment to the organization structures and roles within the organization as well. And the third one is BPM approach. So that's really looking at the standards, methodologies, and tools that are being used for process efforts within the organization. And that fourth one, interaction models, is really looking about the visibility of process management throughout the organization and its standard operating procedures, as well as how business process management interacts with other functions that are focused on similar goals. So a lot of times you can see quality, continuous improvement, performance management from the organizational side rather than the human side, all are kind of looking at that same thing, which is improving the business and the excellence of how we operate. So interaction models also look at how those are tied together. So that's kind of the big picture of how we define governance based on our 7 tenets. One of the things I wanted to talk about was this idea of roles. So common process roles is some research that we've done, just kind of looking at what do organizations need to have in place to have an effective business process management group. And you can see that it's kind of broken up on the process management side here on the left and the business management side on the right. So the left side is really kind of that core process management team within the organization. It could be a department, it can be a center of excellence, but these are the dedicated resources to handle and manage BPM. And you see the key roles here at the top. So the director of process management is really there to keep the trains moving on time. They manage the team, they have oversight across all of the work that's being done and all of the program's aspects. The second part one down there is a BPM expert. And really that is the individual who is more of the technical aspect person. They have a specialization for technologies. So whether it is looking at workflows or process mining or working with ERP systems, they're your technical expert. Now, they may not actually be a part of the BPM team proper. They may be somebody from IT who kind of chips in and works with process projects. The next one is the process analyst, and that's kind of your core person when you're talking about a BPM team. They're the person that works with all kind of the operational aspects of process management. They're the ones that work with kind of analyzing the processes, helping build out new processes, doing performance analysis. A lot of times you can also see a business process analyst swapped out with a BA. So those kind of same skill sets that kind of get a lot of the hard work done. And then there's the process consultant. And the process consultant is really kind of the person that interacts with the business. So they're the people who kind of evangelize process work, but they also go through and identify pain points, help scope out projects, and kind of work as that liaison there. On the right-hand side, you see business management. Now, one of the reasons we make sure to emphasize that there's roles within the business is that because to have process work be effective, businesses need to be invested in the processes. They also need to have some accountability and ownership to make process efforts work and make sure that they're sustainable and also that they're focused on actual business value within the organization. Because a lot of ways, you know, without that, a lot of process efforts are push and then they wind up not getting adopted. So you see the common roles we have here are the process owners. And again, that's kind of the one most people think of synonymously when they think about governance. And a process owner is really an individual that is assigned accountability to manage the change, training, monitoring, and control, as well as continuous improvement for a specific process or set of processes. Now, process owners are usually then supported by a process steward, which is an individual also within the business. But they tend to be a little bit more about the day-to-day management of the process itself. So their scope is a little bit more narrow than the process owner. They could be managing a sub-process, or they could be managing a specific step within the process. And their whole idea, again, is to monitor it, to work with the change, and to work with the process owner to help identify when there may be a problem or something that needs to be fixed, or that there's maybe a misalignment and an opportunity. They're also tapped in when we're doing process work. And that is also subject matter experts. Those are the people in the business who know process area very, very well. They're typically, again, much more narrow in their kind of scope, but they have the ability to help support the organization and support any process efforts because they understand how it's being executed, what are the important aspects of it. And then the last kind of common one we see is a process champion. And that's somebody within the business who is passionate about process work. They may not have a formal process role, but they tend to have some knowledge or get some training on process concepts to be able to help out with the organization and kind of evangelize process efforts within their business unit. And above all, the biggest role that we see is necessary is that steering committee. And the steering committee is kind of that governance team that we talked about as that first element of governance. And the steering committee is really a cross-functional group of leaders. And their goal is to provide oversight and governance for process work. They help prioritize opportunities. They help align processes and process efforts to work with the organization's strategy and its priorities. So again, you can see it takes kind of a village to kind of build out process work in the organization. Everything from the individual level as a subject matter expert or a champion for process, all the way up to kind of the process owner who's managing it for their department or their business unit. And then the steering committee who has that oversight across the organization. So we've kind of talked a little bit about, so here's the common process rules that we've seen and kind of recommend most organizations have one shape or another. Now, especially over on the process management side, you may not have a BPM expert, an analyst, and a consultant. They may all be the same person. But the real key there is making sure you have the capabilities that each of those roles represent in your efforts. So the big question then, as I said, is, so we want to understand how well are people doing? How well are organizations doing in governance? So where do they excel and where do they kind of fall short, which it helps them identify opportunities to help improve. So that we're going to talk about a little bit over the next couple of slides about what are we good at? What are we not good at? And this is based on several different surveys we've done over the years, as well as case studies and conversations with members like yourself to kind of understand what people are doing. So the first kind of area I wanted to talk about was this idea of governance teams. So as we mentioned, governance teams is that overarching group that has oversight over process for the organization. And they help make sure everything's aligned and that they make sure that we're picking the right things to work on. So what we found for most organizations, what we're good at is what we call in the flow governance. And that's that really tactical level governance where we're talking about the execution of a specific process or a discrete improvement project. Most organizations, I think about 75%, have a process owner, which means they have somebody who's at least on paper assigned to have accountability and ownership over discrete processes in the organization. They, of course, have analysts to help with their work. And luckily, they also tap into SMEs, which is great for making sure that we have the right level of information. We know it's actually going to work. And we are engaging people in our process efforts. But much like the fact that we're focused on tactical roles, we also tend to use people in the governance aspect for more tactical execution levels. So your owners, your analysts, your SMEs are going to be part of a project team member for a discrete project. The other thing is that owners and SMEs are also tapped in to help submit ideas. So if they see something wrong going on or they see a potential improvement, they can submit it to be improved upon and have a project based around it. They're also being able, because we tap into owners and SMEs as well, to validate and test our processes, whether we've built a new process from scratch or we've improved a process to make sure that it is going to execute and flow the way that the analysts and the people who are building them out expect them to. Now, our biggest area of opportunity is in this idea of governance above the flow. What we mean by above the flow is all the things from a larger perspective as far as methodologies, as well as that big holistic picture of what process does within the organization. And this really ties into that governance team because it's a big gap as far as how most organizations address their process. Only about a third of organizations have a steering committee or an advisory council or any one of those big groups that provide that holistic oversight that's across representation of leadership from across the different business units. We also don't see that most organizations have those process champions that are kind of embedded into the business and excited about process, or sponsors who are usually executive level people who are sponsoring a specific project or supporting a specific process project, which means that, again, we're missing out on some of those less tactical, more strategic uses of the people in the business. If we don't have a steering committee, most likely people are not going to be a part of a steering committee, which means we're missing out on that, again, holistic perspective. But we also don't have that holistic perspective for how we're identifying what projects to work on, what processes to prioritize first, which means a lot of the times then a lot of that work is kind of ad hoc, and it's either who is first or who's the most assertive that gets their problem solved, not necessarily which ones are best for the organization and its goals. So this is just kind of where we are is in kind of the big picture of the process community as far as governance teams go. And the second kind of place I wanted to look at was roles and approaches. So again, kind of looking at what are we good at and where are our big opportunities. One of the things we're good at in the process world is setting standards. We're incredibly good at picking up methodologies, about documenting processes, getting them put together, creating a standard way to approach work, to identifying specific roles. Like I said, 75% have process owners. So we're really good at kind of that mechanical, technical aspect of setting things down and putting those standards together. Unfortunately, our biggest opportunity is one of the things that makes what we're good at not sustainable in the long run. As we know, most organizations are fraught with some kind of operational silos. So operational silos is also a big opportunity for process teams to help kind of alleviate those. Whether we're talking silos at the business department level, we're looking at the business line, or even regional. Organizations tend to then have little splinter groups who wind up doing things their own way within the organization. Now, if we can remove a lot of those operational silos, we're able to then actually get the benefits and long-term value of what we're good at, which is those standards. Because we're able to do things such as create scalability with our standards and things like that. We can grow if we have a standardized approach to doing things. We're able to look at that holistic view. If we have standards across all of those silos, then we can understand how performance for the organization is across the board, or how performance for all of the different groups of R&D are doing. We can roll those measures up. We can also have a better handle on risk. We understand the big picture of where our risk is because we understand from a standardized perspective how we're executing the work. And also we have a bigger picture of looking at improvements. That way we're not doing an improvement in one area that's going to be at the detriment to another area. Another thing is that we're able to keep our process work sustainable, like I said. If we have standards and we've broken down those silos so that things are adopted across the board, then we're less likely to have people backslide in doing things the way they did, 2 months after the process teams come in and help support and done the improvement work. We're also able to, again, keep away from doing some of that fragmentation. So we've gone through and done an effort to standardize our record-to-report process. But then 3 months later, we have 6 different variations once again, because there is no kind of accountability for making sure that it stays standard across the silos. We're able to do better handoffs between teams. And that's one of the biggest issues with silos sometimes is we don't really understand what's coming to us from upstream or downstream or what we're doing. And so the handoffs between the teams to execute a specific process wind up becoming choke points or places where we start losing cycle times. It also then, by breaking those silos, helps us create that clarity around what the group before me is sending, and they understand what my requirements are, and I understand what the requirements of the group I'm handing off the next work to. And that again makes everything run a lot smoother. Another big reason why standardization operational silos are such a big struggle for us is because it also affects the customer experience. So by breaking down those silos and setting up those standards, we're able to create a consistent experience for our customers, regardless of which function they're interacting with, which product line they're purchasing from. And that also for us gives us a bigger picture of who our customers are. We know what their needs and desires are. We know what their behaviors are. We know what their standing is, who's contacted them when, and when was their last interaction, and how did it go from that picture as we're interacting with our customers. So we have operational silos and standards are kind of the two sides of the coin, and they're a really big opportunity for organizations. And you see here on the bottom, I had a couple of minor to-dos, and these are two other challenges that we've seen that are a little bit easier than kind of dismantling the silos in the organization as far as it comes with governance. One of the big ones is we've seen, like I said, 75% said they had a process owner, but at least about half of those were process owners in name only. And if you don't create buy-in and a passion for process work with your owner, they're probably going to do a minimal effort and just do exactly what's required rather than taking the time and that passion to make sure that their processes are executing well or making sure that they're running smoothly. The other side there is what we call the toolbox of methods. So for ages, organizations would claim that they're either a lean house or a Six Sigma house. While both of those are great methodologies, all methodologies have their flaws. They have their things they're really good at, but they all also have their weaknesses. So over the last few years, what we've seen is organizations developing a full toolbox of methodologies. So lean is great. One of the things with lean is people tend to forget about the fact that it's supposed to be focused on customer value. So instead, lean winds up becoming more of an efficiency powerhouse than really looking at customer value. Six Sigma is also great because it's data-driven decision-making, but so many organizations have holes in their databases to be able to make those decisions. So a lot of organizations have started supplementing other methodologies. So we see things like design thinking showing up, again, to help us keep that customer perspective, but also to help us get out of this idea of incremental improvements and really think through what could be a breakthrough way of how we accomplish something. Because most methodologies are a little slow, people started pulling in agile. Also because there's a lot of technology-driven methodologies these days. And even things like process mining are becoming part of that kind of broader toolkit that we're seeing for organizations. So these are just kind of some of the big strengths and gaps that we see for most organizations when it comes to governance. And as I promised, I wanted to kind of do the last section looking at some case studies. So how are other organizations approaching this idea of governance and some of the aspects of it? And what are some of those great practices that they've done that other organizations can adopt? The first one I want to talk to is this idea of picking process owners. So as we've discussed, process owners are incredibly important. They help us create accountability and give us oversight for our specific processes. Often they're typically either a manager, a director, or a senior executive, because the key there is that they have to have somebody with deep familiarity with the process, but they also have to have leadership capabilities and the authority to get things done and to make sure that they can provide the resources that are necessary and have that kind of bigger picture as well to help couch what's going on with their processes. So some organizations kind of struggle, and we've had horror stories of people who have gone through the registry and just said, oh, this person is the head of finance, so we're going to give them accounts receivable, accounts payable, they're going to be the process owner for all these things. It's not really a great way to approach it. You really, partially because it lacks that buy-in aspect, but also you want to make sure they have the right capabilities to be a good process owner. So CMI is an organization in South America, and we worked with them on a case study on their development of end-to-end processes. And what they did was work with a steering committee to help identify potential process owners for their end-to-end processes using a questionnaire checklist. And you see kind of the three big buckets of information, what they thought were core capabilities necessary for their process owners. And the first one there is this idea of organizational knowledge. We expect the fact that our process owner is going to have subject matter expertise in the topic area, but they also have to understand the organization so they can understand the context of how the process is executed. What are the systems that we use? Who are the people that are involved? It also gives them, the longevity in particular, also helps them develop who their network is. Who do they know how to connect with and have conversations with? Do they know the people on either end of their process? Do they have relationships with them? Do they know how all of these things fit? So that context of how things are executed in the organization was super important to them. The second was BPM experience. They wanted to make sure they were having process owners that had some familiarity with business process work. So they wanted to ask them, they asked them what related projects they had. Again, because change management is a huge part of business process management work, they wanted to make sure they'd run projects and that they'd had change management work in their projects. And again, familiarity with measurement. A lot of job of the process owner is monitoring the health of the process's execution. So they wanted to make sure it was an individual who was comfortable with measurement. Now, one of the other questions they had here under BPM experience that isn't included here in kind of the checklist was they also asked every one of those potential process owners to explain why they should be appointed as a process owner. And the key here was really to help understand that buy-in. Were they passionate about their topic area? Were they passionate about process? Were they somebody who was going to be committed to go beyond kind of the minimal, okay, every quarter I'm going to check my measures? People who are passionate about improvement and continuous improvement. So again, kind of making sure that we have the right fit of personality. And because CMI was looking specifically at end-to-end processes, they also wanted to make sure their process owners had cross-functional experience. They wanted to make sure they understood what end-to-end processes meant. They wanted to make sure that they'd worked on committees or projects with cross-functional team members to understand how all of those pieces fit together and to communicate appropriately. So again, these are just kind of some great kind of selection criteria that we saw CMI use to make sure that they were getting the right person in that process owner seat. And then to go back to the next part then is making sure that you've got buy-in as well. And just because you assign somebody as a process owner, and even if they have some of that experience and all those things we saw with CMI, it doesn't necessarily mean that, they're able to kind of just go from there. One of the things that we see is also incredibly important is making sure your process owners have what they need to shine and do their job efficiently. So this is another great example, which was with Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, or CHOP, as they call themselves for short. For them, they would pick a process owner every time they would have a large scale project. Sometimes that was building a new facility, so they would identify process owners for their main areas. But every time they would do any of these large scale process projects, part of the first step was identifying who was going to be the process owner. So this all kind of then falls into how they go about these 3 steps to making sure that process owner was able to be identified clearly and able to execute their work even after the process team had left. So the first thing they did during kind of the early stages of the project was in their charter, they would identify all of the roles, everybody who was going to be involved in the project, including the process owner. And in that charter, they outlined, the governance structure. What is the decision-making rights for every team member? What is the approximate number of hours they're going to be working it? And then afterwards, one of the other pieces that they put out there was a codified governance document. And that provided clarity on who was responsible for what was their roles, and what were the expectations coming from them. So they created clear documentation so people could understand who owned what processes. And so if you needed to reference that in the future, you could. The last 2 is really how they go about enabling their process owners. So in the second part, what they did is they wanted to make sure the process owners had the capabilities they needed to do their job correctly. And so they would have then in each project, they would have what they called an improvement advisory partner. And that's kind of their version of a process consultant. And that person would work with the process owner one-on-one to make sure they had training and everything they needed to hit the ground running. So they would make sure they understood the kind of the process improvement methodologies the organization was using. What are the regulatory requirements around their process that they're owning? And what was going to be their ongoing responsibilities once the project was closed? And that kind of led into that last way they supported them, which is this automate and schedule. So the improvement advisor would then kind of create regularly scheduled updates, typically once a quarter, and set up alerts for the process owners to go back and review their processes. So just kind of training them to get into the cadence through scheduled alerts, automated alerts, to go back, review the performance of their processes, and potentially also have conversations with the people that were under them about how the process itself was working. They also created a transition plan that identified what the processes had to do. So what are all the aspects of the process they needed to know, how often they had to review, and then they also included a threshold of variation measurement for them. So as they're going back and doing this quarterly reviews, they can look and see, as long as their process was performing within that range, it was steady and stable. So these are just kind of some of the ways that we've seen some organizations help enable their process owners rather than just kind of picking a name and telling them that they were the owner. Without kind of the rest of the support, it can be very difficult for process owners. And even if they're passionate at the beginning, they can get very frustrated and become disengaged with those efforts. Now, the third kind of case study example is really about this idea of standardization and consistency. And University of North Texas, absolutely one of my favorite examples of that. What they were doing is they were trying to create a centralized shared service center across all of their campuses and pull it into one. So what they wanted to do then was start understanding their documentation and start creating that idea of standardization and that one way for people to work. So they took APQC's process classification framework, and they took all the SOPs, all the standard operating procedures across finance, HR, all the rest of the support functions, and they started tagging them associated with the ID number from the framework. So they're able to collate all the standard operating procedures and see where they had multiple variations, where they had no SOPs, and start kind of building from there. And what they wanted to do out of this was then they worked on standardizing their processes. So they would do workshops with each of the relevant groups, and they built this great process repository. And the whole idea behind the repository was to be able to enable people. So going back to that, enabling the individual to move upwards to helping their team and the organization overall. So this repository, what it did was it took the framework and used it as a taxonomy for the SharePoint. And they could drill into pages. So at the highest level, they had their category page. So this is delivering physical products and services as an example on here. Would then drill into the next level, which is procurement. How do we procure material services? And then each one of those kind of level down, those process pages had everything that employees needed to stay standardized in how they were executing that particular process, right? It required all the templates that they needed to do their job, all the forms that were going to need to be filled out. They had their business rules outlined. So they understood what was going to happen when, and if they needed to make a decision. Especially in financial services, they had all of the policies, all of the regulations associated with that particular process outlined. They mapped out their processes. They had their standard operating procedures, as well as lessons learned and access to some of the measures. And again, what was a great thing from what UNT told us was that by the time they finished going through all of this work with the finance team alone, what they had was they had the finance team had what they were working on one screen, and then they had this portal open on the other screen. So they can constantly back and forth reference the steps they needed or any kind of business rules they needed that came up as they were trying to go through and work on the ledgers for the day. So again, this is kind of a great one that shows how you can create standardization, embed it into kind of a system that the organization can use across the board, reducing those silos. And then at the individual level, get that buy-in for people because it makes their jobs easier. So again, it's a great approach to again, looking at driving that consistency. And it's one of the fun ones I thought that way. And the last one, the last example I have is another one that I enjoyed a lot. And it's really looking about marrying process and audit work together. So Seagate, I think it was like 2016, they had a kind of a model where they had their quality team who was responsible for all the external audits. They were going through ISO. And then they had their process team, which was responsible for managing their internal audits and making sure that processes were being executed very well. So the quality team and the process team wound up getting together and having a conversation around how similar what they were doing was and how process and quality should be working together to manage and minimize risk and also improve their chances of getting through audit. So what they worked together to do is they took the ISO standards and then they took that process classification framework and they mapped them out together. So they would take the process classification ID and map out all of the certification standards or the clauses that were related to that process. They also then indicated who the process owner was for that process as well. And it gave them this great document that created clarity when it came to understanding who was responsible for what. But it also then the next kind of step is what I have here is point one. They decided that it made sense then for the process owner to be the person responsible. So they made sure their process owners were responsible for creating a repository. So similar to what UNT did, they would create a page specifically for their project, their process, which outlined their maps, had all of their documentation, had all of their business rules, all of the performance kind of information, as well as the roles, responsibilities, the rest of the people around that, everything that you need for both your internal audits to make sure your process is moving healthily, as well as what you need to show the ISO auditors when they're going through and doing your certification. So it was really great because they then created that responsibility and that ownership that the process owner was going to be the person who would work with the auditor during those certifications, which is great because then you automatically know who has the subject matter expertise particularly to answer the questions for the auditor. It gave reasons for the process owners to manage their processes effectively and keep all that information up to date and be active owners, because they were going to be the ones that are on the hook when it came to the audit as well. So again, it's just a kind of an interesting look at how they took that process owner role and created something that helped with compliance, risk, and and making sure you got through audits very, very well. So these are some 4 great case studies that look at aspects of governance. There's a lot more out there, but these are just kind of some of the ones that I wanted to introduce you to. So as far as next step goes, there's a lot of information on this topic. So you can see some of the research here. As members, you all have access to all of these reports. So there's more information if you want to dive into 7 tenets of process management. The building blocks is a 5-point maturity scale that looks at each tenet in depth and talks about best practices for each one. And then these last 2 are kind of broader ones that look at business process management teams, as well as kind of what are the drivers there that help improve them. So next steps, you guys have access to all of this information. You can also stay up to date to our research by clicking on our research agenda. There may be additional projects coming up that may be useful for the work that you're doing. And if you have any questions, please contact us at any time. You can contact me or you can contact Jack if you have any questions. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a lovely day.